in the reading room of the National Archives of the Netherlands. There is a ship's log from 1629. The handwriting is impeccably neat, with smooth strokes and well-spaced characters. Any elementary school teacher who saw this handwriting would surely praise it. On page 47, the author records the death of a sailor. Cause of death: scurvy. In the same steady hand, the author recorded how the deceased's clothing was distributed among the surviving crew members. A pair of shorts, a woolen cap, a pair of slightly worn shoes. This was not a tragedy. It was simply an inventory, and it is also the most honest document I have ever read about capitalism. The Dutch East India Company, the Verenigd Oost-Indische Company, or VOC, was the most powerful corporation in human history. At its peak, adjusted for inflation, its market value hovered around $8 trillion. It had its own army, its own navy, its own currency, and the legal authority to execute anyone who interfered with its operations. But when I first started researching the VOC, it wasn't the money or the violence that got to me. It was the paperwork. The company kept meticulous records of everything: every shipment of nutmeg, every execution order, every pair of dead men's shoes. 25 million pages of documents survive, and buried in those pages is a story far stranger and more disturbing than the usual evil corporation narrative. It's the story of how a business became a state, how bureaucracy became a weapon, and how ordinary Dutch merchants learned to think of human lives as line items on a balance sheet. The origins of the Dutch East India Company, VOC, were not a heroic tale of exploration. Rather, it was a merger agreement drafted in legal terms. In the late 16th century, Dutch merchants flocked to the East Indies, competing so fiercely with one another that they drove up spice prices at the source, only to cause prices in the Amsterdam market to plummet. Nutmeg, mace, cloves, and cinnamon, these were the oil futures of the 17th century, worth more than gold by weight, yet Dutch merchants were eroding their own profits. In 1602, the government's solution was to force all competing trading companies to merge into a single monopoly. Thus was born the Dutch East India Company, VOC, whose charter granted it powers no private entity had ever possessed. It could wage war, sign treaties, build forts, raise armies, and exercise judicial authority. It could mint coins and annex territories. In effect, it was a sovereign state, with its entire foreign policy dictated by shareholder returns. The company also did something truly revolutionary. It issued shares to the general public. Anyone could buy shares in the East India Company: bakers, widows, retired naval captains, none of whom had to leave Amsterdam to participate in the spice trade. And for nearly 200 years, dividends were paid out steadily, with an average annual return of as high as 18%. If your great-great-grandmother had invested a large sum of money in East India Company stock in 1602 and then simply forgotten about it, you would be a millionaire today. This system was both elegant and rational, but in the most literal sense, it was also built on corpses. The moment the VOC transformed from a trading company into a killing machine is documented in a letter that still exists, in the same archive where that logbook sits. The letter's author is Jan Pieterszoon Coen, the man who would become the company's most celebrated Governor-General. His handwriting is as neat as the logbooks. His tone is calm. He is writing to the Heren 17, the 17 gentlemen who formed the company's board, to justify a recent operation in the Banda Islands. The Bandanese had committed an unforgivable offense. They had sold nutmeg to English merchants instead of exclusively to the VOC. For Coen, this was not a diplomatic problem. It was a supply chain disruption. His solution was to eliminate the source of the disruption entirely. In 1621, Coen arrived with a fleet, Japanese mercenaries, and a plan for systematic annihilation. Over the course of several weeks, VOC forces killed an estimated 13,000 to 14,000 Bandanese. They made no distinction between men and women, adults and children. The survivors, perhaps 1,000 people, were loaded onto ships and transported to Batavia as enslaved laborers. The islands were then repopulated with enslaved workers from other regions, who would tend the nutmeg groves under the company's supervision. Coen's letter to the board describes this operation in language that would not be out of place in a modern quarterly report. He notes the cost of the military expedition, the projected increase in spice yields, and the elimination of competition risk. The word massacre does not appear. The Heren 17 reviewed his report, expressed their satisfaction, and promoted him. I read that letter in translation, sitting in a university library on a rainy afternoon. I remember closing the book and staring at the wall for a long time, not because I had learned something new about human cruelty. History is full of that, but because the letter was so utterly, chillingly banal. Coen genuinely believed he was doing his job well, and by the metrics that mattered to his shareholders, he was. If the Banda massacre represents the VOC at its most ruthlessly efficient, the story of the Batavia represents something else entirely. The company's capacity for madness when the thin veneer of order cracked. In 1628, the Batavia set sail from the Netherlands on her maiden voyage, bound for the East Indies with a cargo of silver coins and trade goods. On board were 341 people: sailors, soldiers, merchants, and a few women and children. The ship also carried a man named Hieronymus Cornelis, a failed apothecary who had fallen in with a heretical sect and was fleeing his debts. He would become one of history's most disturbing villains, not because he was a powerful general or a wealthy magnate, but because he was a nobody who discovered, in the chaos of a shipwreck, exactly how much violence a human being can justify to himself. On June 4, 1629, the Batavia struck a reef off the coast of Western Australia. The survivors made it to a cluster of barren islands, no fresh water, no food, just sand and seabirds. The ship's commander, Francisco Pelsaert, took a small boat and set off for Batavia to get help, leaving the remaining survivors in the charge of a small council of officers. Cornelis, as the most senior company official among them, quickly seized control. What happened next is documented in excruciating detail in the trial records that Pelsaert compiled when he returned months later, and those records read like a horror novel written by an accountant. Cornelis decided that the only way to survive was to reduce the number of mouths. He and a small group of followers began systematically murdering the other survivors. They killed with swords, with axes, with drowning, with hammers. They killed men, women, and children. They kept a rough tally. The daily rations on the islands, the same worm-infested hardtack and foul salted beef that the logbook from 1629 records, were so inadequate that scurvy had already set in, and the living conditions were so miserable that some of the condemned reportedly accepted their fate with eerie resignation. The one thing the survivors had most looked forward to each day, according to one testimony, was the death of a fellow castaway, because it meant they could divide up the deceased's clothing. He found that Cornelis' gang had murdered approximately 125 people. The ringleaders were tried on the spot, their confessions extracted under torture, standard VOC procedure, meticulously documented, and several were hanged from a makeshift gallows built from wreckage. Cornelis himself had both hands chopped off before being executed, a punishment for the particularly grotesque nature of his crimes. The trial records note the cost of the rope. The Batavia is often framed as a historical oddity, a footnote to the larger story of the spice trade, but I think it is the larger story of the spice trade, compressed into a single island. The VOC took ordinary people, failed apothecaries, debtors, ambitious young men seeking their fortunes, placed them in a context where violence was rewarded and empathy was a liability, and then expressed surprise when they behaved monstrously. The company created the conditions for a Hieronymus Cornelis 100 times over, in 100 different outposts, and then recorded the results in its ledgers with the same dispassionate penmanship it used to tally nutmeg sacks. The extirpation campaigns that followed the Banda massacre applied this logic at an industrial scale. The VOC's monopoly required that spices be grown only on company-controlled plantations. Any nutmeg tree or clove bush growing wild or cultivated by local farmers outside the designated zones was a threat to the monopoly, a leak in the supply chain. The company's response was to systematically destroy these unauthorized crops. Fleets would arrive at an island, burn the spice groves, demolish the villages, and either kill or enslave the inhabitants. The Dutch word for this policy was extirpation, uprooting. It was not carried out in a fit of rage. It was a carefully planned, budgeted, and reported process, with quarterly targets and performance reviews. The goal was not to punish, but to create an artificial shortage. By strictly controlling the global supply of spices, the Dutch East India Company ensured that market prices in Amsterdam remained consistently high. The company was not merely selling nutmeg, it was selling the absence of nutmeg, and the profits generated by this absence were far more substantial than those from nutmeg itself. Burning crops to create scarcity may be a rational business strategy, intellectually. I understand this, given that De Beers employed similar tactics in the diamond trade during the 20th century, but when I saw this strategy laid out in detail in a 17th century company memorandum, complete with a full cost-benefit analysis, I felt a wave of physical unease. For nearly 2 centuries, this machine ran smoothly. The East India Company became the dominant power in the East Indies, controlling a territory larger than all of Europe combined. It transformed Batavia into a sprawling colonial capital. It imported slave labor from across the Indian Ocean, laying the foundation for the Cape Colony in South Africa. Its shareholders grew wealthy as a result. This machine began to crumble almost imperceptibly. Ultimately, there was no dramatic cause. Corruption had simply eaten away at its very foundations. Employees stationed 10,000 miles away from headquarters lined their own pockets and used company funds for personal trading. The cost of maintaining a massive military apparatus was eating into profits. Competitors, Britain and France, continually eroded its monopoly. By the end of the 18th century, the Dutch East India Company was deeply in debt and could barely survive on loans from the Dutch government. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, fought from 1780 to 1784, dealt it a fatal blow. The British Navy's dominance cut off trade routes, and the company's stock price plummeted as a result. In 1799, the East India Company was officially dissolved. Its debts were assumed by the state, and its colonies were transferred to the Crown. The demise of this behemoth was not due to a sudden pang of conscience, but because it could no longer generate sufficient returns. This is precisely the detail that has stayed with me the most. It wasn't the massacres, slavery, or genocide. Rather, the downfall of the Dutch East India Company, VOC, stemmed not from moral failings, but from simple arithmetic. If nutmeg production had persisted, if corruption had been kept somewhat in check, and if the British Navy had been slightly weaker, the company might have limped along for another century. I spent several weeks reading VOC documents for this project, logs, letters, court transcripts. I would come home from the library feeling heavy, as if the ink had seeped into my skin. There was one document in particular I kept returning to. It was an inventory of a deceased sailor's possessions, dated 1632, from a ship that had just returned from Batavia. At the bottom of the list, below the shoes and the breeches and the one pewter spoon, the clerk had added a small note. These items returned to the company's store, as the deceased had no heirs. That line, more than Coen's letter, more than the Batavia trial records, is what I think about when I think about the VOC. The company claimed everything, even the dead man's spoon. I don't have a tidy conclusion for you. The VOC is often presented as a lesson, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked corporate power, a historical precedent for the modern anxieties about tech monopolies and private military contractors. But I've come to think that framing misses the point. The VOC was not a cautionary tale. It was a success story for the people who owned shares in it. It did exactly what it was designed to do. The fact that it was also a machine for atrocity was not a bug in the system. It was the system, operating as intended. And the archives in The Hague preserve every detail, should we ever choose to look. Which of these details is going to stick with you? The inventory of a dead man's shoes, carefully itemized alongside the nutmeg? The neat handwriting in Coen's letter, calmly describing a genocide as a market correction? The fact that the Batavia's survivors divided clothing while waiting for the next murder? Or the realization that the VOC's collapse was not a victory of good over evil, but simply the moment the spreadsheet stopped balancing?